Hi friends, today I am going to narrate the summary of the chapter The Last Lesson by Alphonse Daudet. This story is about the effect that had on life at school after the French districts of Alsace and Lorraine passed into Prussian hands. There was a boy named Franz, and that morning he was late for his school. He had a fear of scolding from Mr. Hamel, his teacher, as he would question on participles, and Franz did not know the single word about it. For a moment he thought of spending the day out the classroom. It was a bright day, birds were chirping, and in the open field of sawmill, the Prussian soldiers were drilling. For Franz, it was all more attractive than the rules of participles. But he hurried off to the school. When he passed the town hall, there was a crowd in front of the bulletin board, and for the last 2 years, all the bad news had came from there, the lost battles, the draft, or the orders of the commanding officer. So without stopping, Franz thought that what can be the matter now? Then as he hurried by as fast as he could go, the blacksmith with his apprentice, reading the bulletin, called after him, "Don't go so fast, you'll get to your school in plenty of time." And then Franz thought that they are making fun of him because already he was late for his school. And soon he reached Mr. Hamel's little garden, all out of breath. Usually when school begins, there used to be great noise, the opening and closing of desks, lesson repeated in chorus very loud, and the teacher repeatedly hitting the ruler on the table, which could be heard out in street. But that day, it was all so still. That day, everything was as quiet as Sunday morning. Then, through the window, Franz saw his classmates were already in their places, and Mr. Hamel was walking with his ruler. Franz opened the door and went inside the classroom in front of everyone and was ashamed and afraid, but nothing happened. Mr. Hamel said him kindly, "Go to his place quickly." After Franz sat down at his desk, he saw Mr. Hamel wearing his beautiful green coat, his frilled shirt and black silk cap, which he never wore except on inspection and prize days. The whole school seemed strange and serious, but the thing that surprised Franz the most was to see on the back benches that were always empty, but that day the back benches were filled by village people. Everybody looked sad. While Franz was wondering about it all, Mr. Hamel sat on his chair and in the gentle tone said, "My children, this is the last lesson." That was the last lesson by Mr. Hamel, because the order had came from Berlin to teach only German in the schools of Alsace and Lorraine. The new master would come tomorrow, and Mr. Hamel wanted everyone to be very attentive as it was the last French lesson. What a thunderclap was those words for Franz. It was really unexpected for Franz that could be the notice put up at the town hall. Franz was really sorry for not learning his lesson, just for seeking bird's egg or going for sliding on the Sa. He hardly knew to write French. His books that had seemed such a rubbish a while ago, and his grammar and history book seemed so heavy to carry for him, were like an old friends for him now, which he don't want to leave. And Mr. Hamel too, as he was also leaving. Franz would never see him again. All that thoughts made him forget Mr. Hamel's ruler and his strange nature. Franz was thinking about the dress that Mr. Hamel had wore was in honor of his last lesson. Then he understood why the old men of the village were sitting in the last benches. Franz thought that it was because they were sorry too that they had never gone to school, and it was their way to thank Mr. Hamel for his 40 years of faithful service and of showing respect for their country. While Franz was thinking all that, he heard his name called because it was his turn to recite the participles. But he got confused on the first words and stood there, not daring to look up. Then Franz heard Mr. Hamel saying to him that he won't scold him, but he must feel bad enough that he had always said to himself that he had plenty of time and he will learn tomorrow. But see now where we have come out. That's the trouble with Alsace. They puts off learning till tomorrow. Now those fellows out there will have the right to say to you, how is it you pretend to be Frenchmen and yet you can neither speak nor write your own language? Mr. Hamel also added that your parents were not eager enough to have you learn. They preferred to put you to work for more little money. Mr. Hamel blames himself too, as he sent Franz for watering his flowers and gave holidays whenever he wanted to go for fishing. Then Mr. Hamel talked about French language. He said, French is the most beautiful language and the clearest and most logical. He added that we must protect it and never forget it, because as long as the people who are enslaved remember their language, there is a chance of their being free. That is, if people have hold on their own language, then that means that they have the key for their own freedom. Then he opened a grammar and read the lesson. That time Franz was amazed to see how well he understood the lesson, and for him it seemed so easy. He thought too that he never listened so carefully and Mr. Hamel had never explained with so much patience. Franz thought that Mr. Hamel wanted to give all he knew at once in the mind of students and people in the class. After grammar, they had a lesson in writing, and that day Mr. Hamel had new copies for them, written France Alsace, France Alsace. For Franz, that copies looked like a flag moving around in the whole class, hung from rod at the top of their desks. In the whole class, the only sound that could be heard was of scratching of the pens over the paper. Once some beetles flew in, but no one paid attention to that. Even the littlest one didn't pay attention to that. On the roof, the pigeon cooed very low. Franz thought that, will they make them sing in German, even pigeons? As the French language was being replaced by German, since everyone, even the animals, have a language, Franz wonders what if the new rulers might do. Then, whenever Franz looked up from his writing, he noticed Mr. Hamel looking at each and everything as if he wanted to fix everything in his mind before going away. Franz felt that it would be so hurting and heartbreaking for Mr. Hamel, leaving this place as he had been there for 40 years, with his garden outside the window and his class in front of him, the walnut trees in the garden which were taller, and the hop vine that he had planted himself. After writing, they had the lesson in history, and then, all at once, the church clock struck 12. It was 12 o'clock. At the same moment, Prussian soldiers were returning from drill. Then Mr. Hamel stood up, turned to the blackboard, took a piece of chalk, and with all his strength he wrote as large as he could, Vive la France, that is, Long live France. Then he stopped and bent his head against the wall and indicated to everyone in the class with his hand, School is dismissed, you may go. Thank you, friends. Hope this will be helpful to you. For any query you may ask, and please do subscribe for more English lessons. Thank you.